So yesterday, I got the opportunity to speak to Neil Leitch from the Early Years Alliance, all about his thoughts on the upcoming general election. In our family briefing yesterday, we showed you a few of the highlights, but here is a full clip of the interview for you to enjoy.
From our point of view, I think it's just become a political football, everything seems to be hunky-dory whilst everyone's in power, and then all of a sudden when it gets to an election, early years seems to be pushed up the agenda, and I think from our perspective, of course, that is incredibly frustrating because it isn't just, a moment in time that needs support. It's right the way through. So, yeah, frustrating, I think, Matt, to say the least.
It's frustrating that we have that, that suddenly it's become the big marquee promise for so many of the main parties, and yet it gets ignored the minute that they get into power, seemingly.
Yeah, quite. I mean, unfortunately, I've got years of experience now of, having a variety of politicians in the office, frankly, before general elections, and all seem very critical of the current state of play. And then over a period of time, of course, when various politicians are elected, somehow they seem to have forgotten those conversations, and, from Secretary of States, frankly, to just run-of-the-mill politicians. So, yeah, sort of long in the tooth about it now, really.
So there's obviously a sense of sort of wariness, distrust, even once the promises are out there. But do you think there's also a problem with the way that even publicly, I can see that you've got a concern about how many of these things are going to actually be pulled through on, but even beyond that, do you have any concern about the public framing of the debate on top of that?
Well, I think, and again, this is based on evidence really, but precedent shows that, promises are cheap. And so we had an ironic position back in 2015 where at that particular point in time, and I try not to be too political, but I mean, this is based on evidence, but where Labour were offering 25 hours of so-called free childcare, up from 15 hours and adding another 10 to 25 hours. And the then government, which was a Conservative government, just a few months before the election, was criticising it, saying, do you know how much this would cost? And it's not necessarily in the best interest of children. And then ironically, just 3 or 4 weeks before the election, the same minister who made those statements to the House of Lords Affordable Childcare Committee was making a complete reverse of that, saying, well, we're going to actually top it by another 50%, so we're going to give you 30 hours, unfortunately, at 2/3 of the budget that he suggested it would take to deliver Labour's 25 hours. So, talk is cheap, rhetoric comes forward, but the reality is the evidence shows that once basically you're in power, the offer tends to get diluted, and I think the sector is incredibly weary of that sort of approach.
And now, of course, we have the Liberal Democrats offering 35 hours. And do you think that in particular feels, I know you said you don't want to get too political, but does that feel in particular like it's just adding another 5 extra hours on without any real research back behind it, that it's what's needed?
Well, again, I think it is about what looks like an attractive appeal to families. And if you are a family, and as it currently stands, you get a substantial increase in these free hours, and of course that is attractive. But again, to make it work needs a massive investment. To be fair to them, they have taken, and I couldn't criticise this, they have taken some of the figures from CEDA, and we've been part of that work to make sure that basically the costs are analysed. So they've taken some of that data, but the reality is at the moment we deliver about 500 million places. Their proposal would move us to a position of around 2 billion places, just short of 2 billion places.
No way.
Now, to grow 300% is a massive challenge, and of course what their figures in terms of costings do not factor in is the additional salaries that would be needed to attract a workforce into a sector where what we're seeing actually is a crisis in terms of recruitment. So again, on a balance sheet and on a spreadsheet, some of this might look attractive. Live it, work it, and it is a different story. So, yeah, on the surface, looks attractive. It has got some better costings attached to it, But how you get there needs a little bit more than the current costing sort of structure.
And I think that's an interesting point. Like, do you think there's anything to be positive about in these manifestos? For example, that we're starting to see, at least with the Labour and the Liberal Democrats, that they're punching out some slightly more realistic funding figures. Do you think there is anything to be positive about what we're seeing?
Well, I would be positive about that because, to some degree, this is in the public domain, so they will be held to account. They've actually put numbers against, if you like, the delivery. So for the first time that I can recall in ages, we've seen a monetary amount attached before alongside, I should say, the promise being made. Now that is a starting position, and one of the political parties has also committed to having an annual review, because one of the problems, of course, is that term of office is 5 years. So these costs might be absolutely appropriate, and I'm not suggesting they are, but they could be appropriate at this particular point in time. 5 years down the line is a long time to predict what will happen from an economic perspective, and if nobody adjusts the costs, then we are back where we started at this particular point in time. So hand in hand with the costs, we would want to see that annual review, and at least one of the political parties has offered to do that. So yeah, I think we have to be hopeful that they recognise the value of what the sector does, and they recognise that it will cost money. But am I overly enthusiastic that everything will go to plan? I have to say, 10 years of seeing what has happened to the sector doesn't give me a lot of hope.
That's interesting. Just a couple more questions. I wonder what you think about some of these other external things that outside of the kind of specific hours offers that are kind of changing and seem all over the place. Yep. We've seen some stuff on business rates. We've seen some stuff on workforce and some promises on lofty goal of 150,000 staff in some cases, with obviously things about replacing Ofsted. The Labour promise to put $1 billion in children's centres. Do you see in any of these other kind of almost external factors some interesting stuff that you do feel more positive about, or is it also somewhat more of the same?
Well, I think the investment into children's centres is to be welcomed. I mean, we've seen firsthand some, I guess, experiences of how these have been sort of desolated. So you may still have children's centres, but in general, they are a shell of what they used to be. And interestingly, the families that they would benefit more were predominantly based in areas of deprivation. And so you would argue from a social responsibility perspective, social mobility perspective, that that's where the priority should be. So I don't think we would decry, for example, investments into Sure Start and children's centres. Again, I take it with a pinch of salt when you get figures bandied around of a workforce recruitment strategy that brings another 150,000 into the sector. Live this for the last 10 years, and you struggle to get anybody coming into the sector. We're seeing more and more people leave. We are singled out by the Low Pay Commission as being one of the worst payers in the country. That doesn't sound like it is a sector that is about to attract people from low-paid jobs to come into ours. We have to professionalise this sector. So, again, the rhetoric is all sound, but the finances attached to it aren't sufficient enough. The finances that seem to be coming forward seem to allow us to tread water to a degree. What it does not do is give a substantial investment into the sector that professionalises it and says to people, this is your long-term career. And so I would question all of that, and sort of nice commitments, but we'll see if it works.
I think that's kind of key as well. Like, the thing is I know people feeling like obviously that these are somewhat fast, stuck pledges, and that all the power they have is to choose their vote in that sense. But actually, I know from what you are doing with the Fair Future funding campaign, people need to realise that it's beyond that. They need to make sure that this is top of their MPs' minds and so on. So, if other people out there are feeling perhaps slightly a little wearied by this as you are, what do you think the most important things that we can do to encourage, and what should we be asking the government to be doing?
Well, I think the government should, I guess, strategically look at early years. You would not allow a position, for example, in early years where, nearly half of your employees are basically claiming benefits. If that was state school, if that was, secondary school teachers, we would be in an uproar, basically. It would not be acceptable. And so I think government has to strategically look at this as well as it does financially. It has to recognize that the early years of both care and education and the return on human capital investment is enormous. So that's where the money should be put, but it needs a strategic view on it, not just a sort of, well, here you go, that will fend you off for the next, sort of 18 months. And what worries me, I think, in the proposals that I've seen come forward is if you look at some of the wording, they use words like aim, maybe commit now and again, phased, transition, consider. These are all very ambiguous terms that mean very little strategically and possibly from a monetary perspective. So I think it just has to be, if we wanted this to be a great success, then strategically government has to say, this is where you put your money if you want to basically stop all the remedial work that happens further down the line. Invest early, reap the benefits later on. And so I think if I could argue one thing, if I could sit down in front of every political leader and say, you've got it wrong, I think they've got it wrong in as much as they firefight with money and they need to change the culture of how we view early years in this country.
Yeah, that's great. And what would you recommend that people out there who are kind of passionate about the sector and want to see true change, what would you recommend that they do in order to try and make sure that happens?
Well, I think we have to continue to campaign. I mean, sometimes you get weary. Sometimes, there's a great risk of thinking, well, we've said all this for the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years, whatever it happens to be, very little changes. I think that is what basically, to a degree, politicians rely on, that, we'll just get on with it and we'll do it. I just say to them, persevere, keep going, keep battling, because behind the scenes, it does bring change. We've lobbied long and hard for some sort of statistics and some figures to come forward so that government matched it. We've got that from some of the political parties. They've used the CEDA data to at least look at break-even costing. So that's a positive start. Secondly, we've argued for an annual review to occur so that we don't lurch from one year to the next. All of a sudden, we've got that from one of the political parties. So, if they happen to get in, or if they happen to hold the balance of power, through a minority government, whatever it happened to be, at least we can argue that we're on we're around the table, we've made our mark. So it is very easy to be despondent, but actually we are starting to make inroads, I think.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Neil.
If you enjoyed that, make sure to subscribe so you're getting all of our videos before anyone else. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter to make sure you're seeing all of our fantastic vlog content. We'll see you soon.